want to run a marathon as fast as possible, what kind of shoes should you wear?
Maybe we should go with a typical trainer type shoe that many people have successfully completed marathons in. Maybe we want to go with a more maximal type shoe and get some extra protection for our feet and body from the thick cushioning. Some would say that shoes aren't really necessary and we should go to a more natural style of running. If you want to get a fast time, you might consider shoes that have set world records in the past. These days, we have the option of going towards a new style of marathon shoe that we'll discuss today. There are some shoes that you should never try running a marathon in. While in his final preparations for the 2018 New York City Marathon, Jared Ward was trying to decide which shoes he should wear. He typically had worn this Saucony Type A, which is a very lightweight racing shoe, but was considering some prototype shoes that were being developed. And on the Monday before the race, he received a package of 4 different pairs of these prototypes with different types of foam and different stiffnesses. There's also a carbon fiber plate in these that makes them very stiff in terms of bending. And the race was on Sunday. Wednesday, he had a workout of 4 times 1 mile at race pace with 2-minute recoveries. So we decided, let's try that on the treadmill. We'll put on these blue masks and measure the oxygen uptake, see how much energy it takes to run in each of those shoes. And he put on first the Type A, and then ran his 5-minute pace, which was race pace for him. And we took the final 3 minutes of oxygen uptake and determined how much energy cost there would be for running at that pace in that shoe. Then he tried 3 of these other prototypes. And the first 2 he tried were identical, just the same amount of metabolic cost. Then we put on another one that actually very similar to this one right here, and had a lower density foam in it. And that one allowed him to run 3% lower metabolic cost than any of those others that he'd tried that day. So for Jared, he decided he would go ahead and race in that new shoe that he hadn't even worn before. Week of the race, that's not the normal approach to getting ready for race day. He tried them one more day, a couple days before the race, just to make sure they felt good everywhere, no hot spots or anything. And he went out at a really good pace, had a very good day, finished 6th overall. And what maybe mattered more is he ended up holding off second place American. So Jared ended up being the first American that day and only finished 4 seconds ahead of the second American. Now, you might think, well, that's not that big a deal. Second American would be great, but first American gets $25,000 there. The second American gets $15,000. So we decided the foam in these shoes was worth an extra $10,000 to him that day. I would imagine that saving 3% metabolic cost in a race that takes over 2 hours would translate to at least 4 seconds of a benefit. In 2017, early in the morning, I think it was 5:45 a.m., Lalisa Desisa, Zersine Tadesse, and Eliud Kipchoge attempted to break 2 hours in the marathon. Now, in the organization of this event, everyone realized that they needed to make every situation perfect for these athletes. So they looked at finding a very level surface, good weather conditions, drafting with perfect pacing going on, minimal effort for obtaining nutrition and fluids along the way, and finally footwear that would be optimized for performance. Now, we'll focus on footwear today and consider what took place there. Wouter Hoogkamer, along with some other researchers there in Colorado, looked at the Nike Vaporfly prototype shoe compared to the Adidas Adios Boost and the Zoom Streak from Nike. Those two shoes are the ones that had the most recent world records in the marathon, and then the Vaporfly shoe is one being developed now. Let's take a look at what goes into the design of that shoe. It was already known that adding mass to the feet was going to be a hindrance to performance. The studies in the past have shown somewhere around 1% increase in metabolic cost for every 100 grams of added mass to each shoe. The researchers there in the University of Colorado, combined with the developers at Nike, found that there was a foam that had an 87% return of energy in the way that they tested it, that was very low density and lightweight. So they were able to use quite a large amount of this foam without adding a meaningful amount of mass to the feet. Comparing that with other shoes at the time, the two they used in their study were the Adidas Adios Boost that had a 75.9% energy return, and the Nike Zoom Streak that had a 65.5% energy return. So they came up with this prototype, the Nike Vaporfly, that was a very thick shoe, but still relatively lightweight, somewhere around 200 grams. This shoe, this foam, was able to store and then release most of the energy that was placed in it back into pushing the person back off the ground. This resulted in a slightly longer stride, a little bit more time on the ground, but a lower peak force. So the impulse or overall change in momentum that a person would receive from hitting the ground and coming back off was about equal, but less force was required to do that, and it led to that longer stride. So in the end, we saw greater performance times when wearing this type of shoe. A lot of attention has been placed upon the carbon fiber plate, some saying it works as a spring and so on. But if it does work as a spring, it's not in the right direction to give energy back to the body. The foam, I believe, is the main benefit because of how it stores and releases energy, but the shoe is so thick that when you try running around a sharp turn in these, it feels like the shoe's going to collapse over to itself and not give you the energy back in the right direction in that case. But having that plate throughout provides some integrity to that shoe. So when you're running and especially going around turns, it maintains its shape a lot more effectively, at least in the directions that you care about for that. The plate also, with that limitation of bending, will reduce the amount of hyperextension of the metatarsophalangeal joint. Now, that will change the moment arm, at least around the ankle, and perhaps even the knee and hip. As the foot rolls forward, notice the center of pressure would be more anterior if flexion or extension is not allowed at that joint. So we end up, in a way, having a longer foot that's going to change that mechanical advantage around the ankle, geared more towards speed rather than strength, which will also give some benefit to the performance of the athlete.
There's a few components I feel like. I guess I would say the main component is the foam, but shape has taken a drastic turn, and the stiff plate inside of the foam gives us the flexibility to use more low density foam than we have been able to in the past. And so, I don't know, I really think that the new aspect of these shoes is a triple threat effect of foam, plate, and shape, but probably the main component being the foam.
Something good to investigate would be how stiff does that carbon fiber plate have to be? We recently got a published study that focused on the stiffness of the plate embedded into the shoe. There were complaints about insoles being carbon fiber because of the hardness of landing on that. So we decided to take the carbon fiber plates and embed them just inside the outsole below the midsole, or in between the midsole and outsole. We created plates ranging from 2 thicknesses of carbon fiber up through 6 layers of carbon fiber, along with a control shoe that had no plate in it. And we found that on average, around 3 or 4 plates was the thickness that gave the least metabolic cost. However, there was a big range. For some people, it seemed we couldn't make a shoe stiff enough, and for some, even the control shoe was not quite as pliant as would be desirable for that person for metabolic cost. So we found for the average person, it's right there in the middle, but there's a huge variance that we weren't able to detect based on our anatomical measures and so on, what the reasons were for someone preferring a stiff compared to a pliant shoe. So that's still an area that needs to be researched more. So the carbon fiber plate does seem to have some benefit, somewhere around 1 or 1.5% in metabolic cost. And then this thick, low-density foam is what likely makes up the rest of the benefit of these new styles of marathon shoes. I don't normally get a haircut halfway through a presentation, but we had some different options here of how we might approach this, and it's been a week since I started with the first part of this. So the next part I wanted to think about was how much of a benefit do runners actually get from this in terms of performance times. So between the recent studies that have been published, it seems there's somewhere between about a 2.7 and 4.0% decrease in metabolic cost when running with the newer style of marathon shoes compared to the more traditional ones. There's been a range of at least 0% benefit up through 6.2% benefit was one of the studies, one of the runners in our study. Now, performance times don't match exactly with reductions in metabolic cost, but there is a pretty good correlation there that still needs to be investigated a bit further. But it seems that performance times will be somewhere between 1 and 2% faster when we consider somewhere around a 3 or 4% decrease in metabolic cost. Now, if we look at the second attempt of the sub-2 marathon, there Kipchoge ran it with around 40 different pacers that would alternate in and out, I think about every 5K, and he did accomplish it in the second go, went 1:59:40. Now, if we take that 1 or 2% benefit from the shoes in terms of performance time with what was Kipchoge's current official world record, that was 2:01:39. Taking away 1% from that would put us at 2 hours, 26 seconds. 2% would be 1:59:26. So it seems we're pretty close there on the estimations, mainly from Hukammer's research and Crom, that we're pretty close there on these estimations. And if we apply that to other people, there may be a question of what about slower runners? Or everyone else in the world is a slower runner. Does it still work? In the first article published by Hukammer, they looked at 3 different speeds. I think it was 14, 16, and 18 kilometers per hour, which is something like 5:20 per mile, 6-minute mile, and close to 7-minute mile pace. They found that 4% benefit in their study across all the different speeds. So it does seem that these adjustments can work for just about anybody.
They feel faster for sure. I don't know exactly what it translates to, but you know, just kind of in workouts, like tempo runs, workouts on the road, a few seconds a mile, you know, maybe 4 seconds a mile.
You know, conventional knowledge, I guess, for the limited research we have is maybe half that. So I'm 3% more efficient aerobically, so I run 1 to 2% faster. But that's only a part of the story when considering marathon shoes, because this shoe is going to reduce the eccentric loading that my muscles have to do when I'm running compared with a more minimal shoe like this. And so at the end of a marathon, my muscles are less broken up. And it's not necessarily at the end of a marathon that I'm breathing hard and in oxygen debt and couldn't talk to you if you were running next to me. In fact, if you could keep up with me, we could talk. Well, I could talk, but it's not an aerobic concern at that point. It's not like I'm breathing so hard that I'm not getting enough oxygen. My legs are flat. And so I think there's some work to be done studying what these shoes are doing to preserve legs and muscle tissue towards the end of a race. And we notice, I notice, and there seems to be a consensus about how much quicker legs and muscles are recovering after a marathon in the newer versions of shoes, of racing shoes, as compared to old ones. And so there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how much faster these shoes are making an athlete in a race.
I definitely believe that there's a good hybrid between a spike and a marathon shoe that would actually be ideal. And I'm still waiting for somebody to innovate that. Leading up into the NCAA 10K, there was a chance that there was going to be rain. And so there was a little bit of risk trying to decide, okay, should I wear spikes because the track might be slick, or should I wear something that I'm more comfortable in, that being the Vaporfly. And really, at the end of the day, I decided to go with the Vaporfly for two reasons. Number one, I had done some track workouts that I could close a 400 meter in 55 seconds in a Vaporfly. And I was like, well, I'm not going to really need that kind of speed in a 10K. So I don't think the Vaporfly is holding me back in that regard. And the other big reason was I was coming back for the 5K 2 days later. And these marathon shoes are kind to the body. They make it so you don't get fatigued as often. You don't get sore Achilles and calves from wearing spikes. So that was one of the big reasons I wanted to come back 2 days later in the 5K and be able to have fresh legs and to give it a chance. But kind of going back to, I think that there's a good balance between the spike and the marathon shoe that they should develop. You look at the newer marathon shoes and they have a really high stack height. And that can kind of be precarious when going around the corners, especially really fast on a track. But I think if they lowered it a little bit, kind of like their original marathon shoe, this is the ASICS Meta Racer, it's got a little bit lower stack height, but then they put maybe very minimal spikes on the bottom. I think you'd have the best of both worlds, where you could still have that agility on the corners, but that raw speed as well from the spikes, as well as the cushion and the protection from the stack height.
Take a look at this 5K race from the 2012 Olympic trials, and you'll notice that even though this is the top about 24 runners in the country, they are not doing things the same way. You'll see that some are carrying their arms a little bit differently. Some have a higher backswing, the foot coming up further off the ground. Some are driving the knee up higher than others, a short stride, a long stride, rotation of the torso, a different type of lean, and so on. There's a lot of different ways that people move to accomplish the same task of, in this case, running a 5K race. Now, when you put some equipment on the foot, like a shoe, then you're going to modify how the forces are placed upon that body. And so that gets me thinking, will there be some people that benefit more from this type of shoe than others? When we've looked at this and generally testing these shoes compared to the older style, we found anywhere from 0 to 6.2% of a benefit from the newer style of marathoning shoes. So who does it work better for? We worked on a study where we pulled in a whole bunch of mechanical data of running to compare that or correlate it with the benefit that they were getting from wearing these new shoes. And most of it showed nothing, or at least so much variability we couldn't pull out anything very meaningful from it. But we did come across one finding that does have variability around it, but there does seem to be a clear trend that the runners that spend less time on the ground obtain a greater benefit from switching to this type of shoe. when we take the groups of one simple measure, midfoot strike compared to heel strike, it seems that the heel strikers are getting a little bit more of a benefit than the midfoot strikers. That messes things up a little bit because heel strikers tend to spend more time on the ground. So it seems like maybe what we want for the person that gets the most benefit from this shoe is a heel striker that spends very little time on the ground. So let's think about how we can apply what we've got out of this. We do know that this new style of marathon shoe is effective for most people on helping them run with a lower running economy. So somewhere from 0 to 6% benefit to the athletes in terms of economy, which translates to anywhere from 0 to maybe 2 or 3% changes in their performance times. But what does this mean to the everyday runner? I think you should consider what the purpose of the run you're doing at the time is, and that can help guide you to which shoe is going to be most appropriate for the run. If your goal is performance time in road racing, then I'd recommend going to one of these new style of, we call them typically marathon shoes, but it turns out at least 3K and maybe even shorter, but 3K and up seems to have some good benefits from using these types of shoes. If you're on the track, typically for distance racing, we've had spikes like this where there's very minimal amount of cushioning, just enough to protect the foot and have a spike plate built into it. But in the near future, we're going to start seeing these being elevated a bit in terms of midsole thickness. The traction that comes from the spike plate is going to be a benefit when you're racing on the track, but getting a little bit more energy return from a thicker midsole is where we'll see going for spiked shoes. If you do a lot of hard workouts in your training, you might have those days where you wake up and lower legs, feet feel kind of sore and achy, beat up from whatever you did the day before. I felt that feeling myself, and one time I was at a local running store around here looking for a minimal shoe for a study that we were going to do. This is the one that I came across that has very little support of the foot and just enough to protect you from sharp objects and so on. So I ended up choosing this one, which I'll mention a purpose for soon. But when I was done with that, I asked the salesman if I could try a pair of the Hoka shoes on, which at the time I thought were just a joke. It's so silly. If you start rolling your ankle, you might break your ankle with the torque that would be there from bigger moment arm of the ground to your ankle. And it just seemed dangerous to me to run in these, especially if you are out ultra marathoning, running over roots and rocks. It's too high. So I was concerned about them, but thought I'm telling people about them without actually wearing them. After taking one step in these shoes in their little mini track they had in their store, I thought, oh, I'd like a pair of these. So I quickly changed my mind on if these were worth having or not. But I don't think they're good for racing in, at least this model of the shoe. They're too heavy. But the day after one of those hard workouts, legs kind of beat up, this is a nice way to get some really good cushioning and protection of the body when it's in this damaged state, if there's still some running that you want to get in that day. So there's a good purpose for that type of shoe. I still do most of my miles in a shoe like this, where it's kind of the more traditional style running shoe. And in this one, you can put a lot of miles on it. It lasts a long time. It gives you some decent protection of the foot and body. Not designed for performance times, but a little more lightweight than one like this. The minimalist shoe has a purpose, I feel. Either minimalist or maybe even barefoot on a surface where you won't have to worry about damaging your foot. We do know that the bones of the foot and the intrinsic muscles of the foot gain some strength when running without so much protection like these other shoes. So there is a good purpose to wearing a minimalist shoe, I think some of the time, getting the feet a little bit stronger. The rest of the time, I prefer a little more protection on the foot or a shoe specific for the workout or race that we're doing. This one is kind of in between what we might see with the new style of racing shoes and the older marathoning shoes, where it's lighter and less thick than the training shoes, but this might be something to consider if you don't want to pay for the extra cost of the new marathoning shoes. These ones are about half the cost and have a lightweight foam. They're just not as thick. They don't have the carbon fiber plate, so a little less energy return, but still a good quality shoe. A lot of my long road workouts I do in this rather than wearing out my expensive marathoning shoes. So at the end of this presentation, what I want you thinking of is we've got various shoes that have their purposes. Some are better than others between companies and models of those shoes, but consider, why am I going on this run today? Choose the appropriate shoe for it. And since not everyone responds the same way to each shoe, then try out a few different options and see what feels best to you and what you perform best in. And the companies will continue developing their technologies, and we'll see where we are 10 years from now. Although the rules have recently gone through some changes which put restrictions on some of the design of current racing shoes, there's still some room for improvement, whether it's from chemical engineers determining more effective ways to create the foam to perhaps be a lower density and give a better energy return. Maybe it's something with the carbon fiber plate shape, perhaps even the shape of the shoe, maybe some other factors we haven't even considered today. So the question still remains, though, of is it right to have the shoe be what makes the person fast rather than just seeing how fast can this person run? Now, the primary factor of how good someone's going to be at running is dealing with their genetics along with what they do with their activity to become really fit. So we're still measuring the fitness of these athletes and how prepared they are on the race day for their performance. And the shoes are relatively similar across the athletes these days. And there'll continue to be little improvements company by company that will make the athletes even quicker. But this is only a small fraction of what determines their performance time on any given day. So I like to look at it as similar to what we saw in tennis. If you think of the 70s, we had wooden tennis rackets that transitioned to aluminum rackets, and then other types of materials that have transitioned through to what we see today. Even the shapes of tennis rackets have changed, and the technologies used to design the strings. And that definitely changed the performance of the game of tennis. We see generally the same strategy, but a lot different ball speeds and different athletes that are excelling in those events. So we're seeing similar things going on in footwear, although the changes might not be as dramatic as what we see in some other athletic competitive events. So from here, we'll see within the rules that are prescribed what can be done to make these shoes as fast as possible.